So we're going to be looking at Matthew chapter 8, verses 1 through 4 today. And we're going to be looking at this, so it'll be on the screen. This is in verse 1 of chapter 8. When Jesus came down from the mountainside, large crowds followed him. And a man with leprosy came and knelt before him and said, "Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean." Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man, and he said, "I am willing, be clean." And immediately he was cleansed of his leprosy. And then Jesus said to him, "See that you don't tell anyone, but go show yourself to the priest and offer the gift Moses commanded as a testimony to him." Please pray with me. Lord, I pray this morning we just hear you and celebrate you and your work. And God, that anything that's distracting us or just bringing us down, this would just be a moment of respite from it, God. Pray this in Jesus' name, amen. So I read this one from Matthew, this miracle, for a couple of reasons. This is a unique miracle for two main reasons. One, this is the first miracle in the Gospel of Matthew. So if you're reading your Bible from beginning to end, Genesis to Revelation, you'll get to the end of the Old Testament, and it kind of leaves the story hanging when you finish the Old Testament. But then you would turn the page to the Gospel of Matthew, which wasn't the first one written, but it's the first one that appears in our New Testament. And we start to meet this guy, Jesus. And it says that this guy is doing healings and miracles, but this is actually the first miracle that we get, that we actually see the story. We hear what happens and we see the components. So because of that, I find that pretty interesting. If this is the first one, this is the first miracle, the first healing, then to me that's like, okay, well, maybe I should pay attention to this and see what this has to tell me about who Jesus is. The next unique thing about this miracle is that it comes right after the Sermon on the Mount. Verse 1 of chapter 8 actually says Jesus came down from the mountainside. So he is fresh off this sermon. And if you don't know what the Sermon on the Mount is, it's in Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7. 3 chapters. You could go home, you could read it, you could knock it out. If you get bored while I'm preaching, you can knock it out in church, like just, 2 for the price of 1. That's pretty good. It's incredible. This sermon is amazing. It's maybe one of the most famous sermons in all of the Bible, if not easily number 1. And I'm actually just going to read some verses from the Sermon on the Mount. Rather than talk about how great it is, you guys can see how awesome this sermon is and how packed with truth it is. So I'm just going to read some verses, and these verses, I didn't, painstakingly try and figure out which exact verses from the Sermon on the Mount I should reference. I literally this week just read through it, and as verses just hit me, I was like, yep, these work, because there's an endless amount of amazing verses to choose from. And so here's just a few. "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." The next one is, "You have heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes the sun to rise on the evil and the good and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous." That's chapter 5. The next couple verses are from chapter 6. "So when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets, to be honored by others. Truly I tell you, they've received their reward in full already. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret, and then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you." I got a couple more from the Sermon on the Mount. This is also in chapter 6. "No one can serve 2 masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money." And then I think I've got 2 more. "Therefore, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own." "Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, 'Let me take that speck out of your eye,' when all the time there is a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. So in everything, to sum all this up, this is chapter 7. So in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you, for this sums up the law and the prophets. When they talk about the Old Testament and the New Testament, oftentimes they call it the law and the prophets. It's the whole thing. And so right there, Jesus says, that sums up the law and the prophets. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And so Jesus gives this sermon that's just amazing. I mean, this guy knocks it out of the park. And this whole sermon, by the way, we see in Luke and in Matthew who's at this sermon. Well, Jesus has been going around teaching, and he's been healing the sick, and he's been loving and caring for the people that the society has put on the outskirts. He is caring for the sick, and he's interacting and caring for and loving for the people that everyone else doesn't have time for. They've pushed to the margins. And so at this sermon actually are the people that are poor in spirit and are mourning and struggling. And as you can see from these verses, a lot of these teachings are geared toward those people. And this sermon really, at the end of the day, is all about how to be a member of the kingdom of God. Or another way to say that is how to be a member of God's family. Jesus is on a mission to restore order back to God. He's on a mission to bring us from sin and death and to bring us to the Father instead. And this whole sermon is how do we live as people who follow Jesus? How do we live in this kingdom of God, this kingdom that surpasses and is above any other kingdoms we might belong to on earth, right? Like everybody on earth is a part of some government, a part of some nation. We all come from a certain culture, societies, and backgrounds. But this kingdom is for everybody. This kingdom, it doesn't matter where you came from or what you've known. It's for you, it's for me, it's for all of us. And so Jesus preaches this sermon, and it's to this crowd of marginalized people. And then Jesus comes off the mountain. And man, chapter 8, verse 1, the crowds are all around him. I mean, this guy is popular with his teaching. One, he teaches in a way no one else teaches. He has authority. And he's saying stuff that nobody else is saying. So there's this huge following. It's like Beatlemania, but Jesus mania. And for those of you who don't know what Beatlemania is, it's like Taylor Swift, dude. I mean, it's like a big deal. Like, this guy is popular, all right? He's the number one dude at the time. Huge crowd around him, and then right off the bat, something happens that sets Jesus apart from any other rabbi, teacher, preacher at the time. He puts his money where his mouth is. Jesus gives a whole sermon on serving people and loving people, and as soon as he comes off the mountain, we are going to see someone's going to put Jesus to the test. Can this guy, he talks the talk, but can he walk the walk? And as we've already read in that chapter, yes, Jesus does walk the walk as well. That's what sets Jesus apart, right? He's not just a good teacher. He's not just like a social revolutionary. No, this guy is the Son of God. This is the real deal. He's not just somebody else that's like, oh yeah, like, man, that Jesus guy, he's cool. No, this guy is God himself become human to bring us back to him, to right the ship, course correct. That's what Jesus does with his death and resurrection, which we're going to be looking at heavily here in a couple weeks with Easter and Palm Sunday. And so Jesus comes off the mountain, he's given this amazing sermon, and right off the bat, chapter 8, verse 1, a man with leprosy comes up to him and bows down before Jesus. This is shocking for a couple of reasons. People with leprosy, that's like a skin disease that's contagious. And people thought that if you had leprosy, that meant you had some sort of moral failure. So there were actually lots of reasons that people with leprosy were pushed out of society and culture. They weren't allowed to live with anyone else because they had this contagious disease. But not only because of that, but like I just said, also because back then, this is kind of pre-science, pre-knowing how things work, they thought if you had this leprosy, if you had this skin disease, We have to outcast you, not only because it's contagious, because you must have done something wrong. Like you must have done something to deserve this. So sick equaled immoral back then. It was like, you know what, we're going to excommunicate you from your family, your society, culture, not only because you're sick, but because we know you did something wrong. There's some sort of curse on you. Jesus himself preaches against this. He teaches that this isn't right. But at the time, this was how it was done. Being sick carried with it not only the sickness and not only this disease of the skin that was probably killing this man, but also shame and guilt for something that maybe he didn't even do, probably didn't even do. This "you're an outcast" guy. I was in Mexico as a missionary when COVID hit, and I remember the first week of COVID, I was in line at a grocery store, and I had to sneeze really badly. And I thought, if I sneeze, they're kicking me out of here. Like, this is going to be it. Everyone's going to turn. They're going to be like, this guy's sick. Get him out of here. So, because of COVID, we all know what it's like to be sick and trying to avoid people. But I don't think many of us know exactly how this feels. Or maybe you have felt this before when you are just kicked out. Or you've just felt on the outside. Or you felt like, hey, for some reason, these people won't let me belong here. Sick equaled immoral. Also, there's another reason that lepers were outcast and they were extra away, is because sick also meant unclean. So in the Jewish law at the time, if you had these skin diseases, you weren't allowed in the temple or the synagogue. Think about that for a second. For the Hebrew people, their faith was everything to them. It wasn't just their religion, it was their faith, but it was also, that's their people. They're under Roman occupation. The one place they can go and be totally Jewish and be totally following the Lord is at temple or synagogue. And this guy, he's not allowed there. That word leper literally means skin disease and like outcast. Can't come into the temple anymore or the synagogue. So you got this big crowd around Jesus, and can you imagine the scandal and the outrage when this man with leprosy bursts through the crowd and falls at Jesus' feet? I'm sure everybody just got out of the way, because if they touch this guy at all, it's a big deal. Like, man, maybe I got this sickness from him. And can you imagine, this guy, obviously Jesus' teachings are getting around, because this guy comes to hear Jesus. He's like, you know what, I need to hear this guy's words. And after the sermon, it was so moving, so powerful, this guy breaks every social norm, every barrier, and he runs to Jesus, gets at his feet, and says, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean. I actually love how this is said in the Greek even more than I like it in English. In the Greek, it reads like this. It's weird English, but it's good. It's pretty good Greek. It says, Lord, if you will it, you're able. Lord, if you're willing, or if you will it, you're able. I want to have that faith in Jesus. I want to have that confidence that I know if it's in his will, he can do it. If he's willing, he's got this. He can make me clean. Lord, if you are willing, you are able. And I'm sure everybody's watching this scene as this guy with leprosy is right next to a rabbi, a holy person and an unclean person. Someone who can't even go into the temple with somebody who just gave this amazing sermon. And I don't know what they expected in the moment, but I'm guessing they were mad at the guy with leprosy. And then Jesus does a couple things that are super surprising. The first thing he does is the most shocking thing of all. In verse 3, it says, Jesus reached out his hand and he touches the man. And he says, I am willing, be clean. And immediately he was cleansed of his leprosy. We got to think, this guy was not even allowed to have human contact for who knows how long, right? Like maybe he had leprosy for a week. Maybe he had leprosy for a couple months. Maybe he had leprosy for years and years of his life. which means this guy hadn't had physical interaction with another human for years. And I think the first thing Jesus does, because Jesus could have stayed at a distance and been like, you know what, man, you're healed. Okay, cool. Like, let's high five. Like, he could have healed him. Jesus could do anything he wants. He could have healed him from a distance. He could have said, go home and I'll heal you. Like, hey, get out of the crowd first. The first thing Jesus does is he touches him. I'm feeling like he puts his hand on his shoulder. The first thing, I think he takes care of this need that this guy really has, and it's to be treated as a human. It's to have somebody look him in the eye and touch him, give him that love, that physical interaction. We all, as humans, we need a hug, we need a pat on the back, we need somebody to, shake our hand, whatever, right? We need that. We crave it, that love. And that's the first thing Jesus does, is he loves this guy right where he's at and gives him what he really needs, and that's to be treated as a human. The second thing Jesus does is he heals the man. I mean, talk about Jesus being the real deal, right? He gives this amazing sermon, then he comes off the mountain, and he loves a guy society says he can't love, says this guy's done something wrong, he's shameful, and he's got this disease. And Jesus touches him, heals him. And then the third thing Jesus does, which is easy to forget about if you preach this, by the way, the last thing Jesus does is he says, see that you don't tell anyone, but go show yourself to the priest and offer the gift Moses commanded as a testimony to them. Moses snuck into my sermon this morning, which is really great. He couldn't stay out of it. This is huge because the first thing Jesus tells this guy to do is what? All right, go back to the synagogue. Go back to the temple. The first thing he tells this man who has been outcast for who knows how long is, all right, go back. You can go back to the temple now. Go and actually do the thing of worship. Like, go offer a gift at the altar, which is participating in worship. Go worship. And when you do this is a testimony to the priests. I love that. It's like after we meet Jesus, everything we do from then on out is a testimony about Jesus, about what he's done for us. I love this scene. It's this guy who has something that symbolizes death, this disease, and because of that, no one can touch him. But when Jesus touches him, the life of Jesus moves from Jesus to this man, and he's healed, and he's clean. That's what happens when all of us, when we meet Jesus and we put our faith in him and our trust, Jesus is God. He's the life giver. He's the great I am. And so that life just comes and frees us and changes us. And he goes back to his place of worship and he does something that's a testimony of what God has done for him. That's what these 3 young women are doing today, right? Like they're being baptized as a testimony to all of us and to the world of what Jesus has done in their lives. And every day we have an opportunity to have a testimony, give testimony to what Jesus has done in our lives. And so this man is healed not only of a disease, but he's back in community. He's back with his family. And he's changed by Jesus. He's changed by this man who saw him not for his disease, but for who he is as a person, as a human. Because when Jesus looks at us, he doesn't see all that's wrong with us. He doesn't try and guilt us. He doesn't try and throw all the shame on us. He just sees us as one of his children. And he's willing. He's willing to clean us up. And so there's 2 sermons I could preach from this passage, by the way. There's two different ways this could go. Sermon number 1, Jesus is a model for the church. This passage, this is what the church should always do. It should talk the talk and walk the walk. We should be the hands and feet of Christ, going out and loving and caring for people in our world, in our society that are on the margins. Jesus is the example, and we should follow him. That's sermon number 1. Sermon number 2, and I think this is really what Matthew is getting after here, is that I'm the leper when I read this story. I don't know about you. Someday, hopefully, I read this story, and I'm like, oh yeah, man, I'm going to go be like Jesus. That too. But I read this, my first thought is I'm the leper. I'm somebody who, you know what, sometimes there's a lot of obstacles in my mind between me and God. That might be like you. There might be obstacles between us and God sometimes. Maybe it's fear of what other people will think. It could be there's a crowd between this man and Jesus. It could be the crowd. It could be the church crowd. It could be hard to open up. It could be hard to go be real with people. And for this man, I think it was ultimately the shame. I mean, this guy has this disease, and he's supposed to have done something unclean, wrong even. But Jesus, when he looks at us, I mean, I think shame is the ultimate liar, right? Shame is the ultimate thing that keeps us back from being real and authentic. And Jesus just wants us to be real and authentic. Christianity is built on the idea that, hey, we're all sinners, so there should be no surprise when we find out that somebody else is a sinner, right? Because that's what the whole thing is built on, is that we're sinners and God still loves us all the same. And this guy who comes to Jesus, he kneels down and Jesus says, yeah, of course I'm willing. Shame will say, hey, we're not good enough. We got to stay back. We can't be real. We got to stay away from God. It'll keep us at bay, but it's such a liar, because the moment we come to Jesus, he says, yeah, I'm willing. And he heals, cleans, and we're back in community. It's a lifelong process, by the way, because shame doesn't just go away when you start following Jesus, right? Like, it's an ongoing process. Because I think, honestly, at the end of the day, we think, man, I got to be perfect. I got to get it all together. Then maybe I could go to church, or then maybe I could pray, or then maybe I could start serving the Lord in some capacity. But we're never going to be perfect. We're never going to have it all together. I'm never going to be perfect. We'll never be perfect, but Jesus will always be willing. Jesus will always be willing to meet us right where we're at. Timothy Keller, who's an American pastor and theologian, has a great quote that I love. He sums up the gospel in saying this: this is the gospel. It's that you're fully known and fully loved. Jesus sees the whole thing. Jesus doesn't see what I just only bring to church on Sunday morning. Jesus knows the whole me. Even the stuff I'd rather people don't know, right? He knows the whole thing, and he loves me. Jesus knows you. He actually probably knows you better than you know yourself, and he loves you. And so the question is, how do we respond to that love? Do we overcome shame and fear? Do we let Jesus overcome shame and fear and go to him and say, Lord, if you're willing, I know you're able? To which Jesus responds, I'm willing.